Okay, as we start chapter 6, which is trigonometry, we're going to be looking at a different way of representing angles or quantities dealing with angles and movement other than degrees. So we're going to be looking at radians. A radian technically is another form or another way to represent the angle. So if that's the angle, in any angle that you make, technically it can be made into a circle. And then this part here is called the arc length. Okay. So any angle that we make will have an arc length and a radius. So the measure of that angle in radians is just going to be considered the arc length divided by the radius. So any angle can be represented using degrees and radians. The difference is degree is just the actual physical measurement, whereas radians is going to be the arc length divided by the radius of any circle that's created. Obviously the radius can extend out, it can become shorter, which will extend or shorten the actual arc length itself. The questions for the most part are going to be dealing with how do you convert from degrees to radians. This section is mainly to get you comfortable with using radians rather than degrees. So a few things to look at. One is how do you convert from degrees to radians? So let's take something straightforward like 90 degrees. To convert from degrees to radians, you're going to multiply by pi over 180. Okay. So if we turn 90 degrees into multiplied by pi over 180, we're going to do 90 multiplied by pi over 180. The 180 and the 90 cancel out. So this is 1, this is 2. You're left with pi over 2. So 90 degrees is the same thing as pi over 2 radians. If we take something else like, let's take 270 degrees, and you multiply it by pi over 180. Again, to convert from degrees to radians, you multiply by pi over 180. Let's simplify our fraction now, right? Because essentially you multiply the top and the bottom is 1. So the 10 can be factored out. 27, 18, both divisible by 9. That's 3, and that would be 2. So we're left with 3 pi over 2. We can go ahead and say 3 times pi, which is going to be like 9.42 or somewhere in that range, divided by 2, which is like 4.6. But we would leave it as fractions, right? It's very important that you do not try to convert everything into decimals. Leave it as a fraction. It's much easier to keep track of these numbers rather than to work with decimals that you obtained by dividing pi. Pi is an infinite decimal. So if you were to, divide it, it would still be another decimal where you're constantly rounding. One thing to remember is another way to convert is to remember that pi is 180 degrees. More specifically, pi radians is 180 degrees. So pi over 2 radians would be 180 divided by 2, which is 90 degrees. Pi over 4 radians would again be half of that, so that's another 45 degrees. So you can always think of pi as being 180 degrees, and then if you divide it by 2, then it's 90, divided by 6, then it's 30, divided by 3, then it's 60. So you can always divide by the number, and you can divide 180 by that, which we're going to use now to do the second part, which is how do you convert from radians to degrees? Wow, that's terrible. The simple way is to multiply by 180 over pi. So to go from degrees to radians, it's pi over 180. To go from radians to degrees, it's 180 over pi. Just remember, it's 180 and pi is what you're using to convert. When you want the answer to be in radians, there should be a pi. So the pi is at top. When you are converting to degrees, you're getting rid of the pi. So you put the pi at the bottom. So how do you convert now? Let's take something that we know, which is pi over 4. Pi over 4, we would multiply it by 180 over pi. The pi's cancel out, and we're left with 180 divided by 4, which is going to be 45 degrees. Let's take a different approach. Let's say 2 pi over 3. So pi is 180. So 180 divided into 3 parts would be 60, 60, and 60. So pi over 3 would be 60, but then you have 2 of them. So that means two 60s would be 180 degrees. Right? So 120 degrees, you might say. I'm going ahead to the next part, which is, again, if you were to do it this way, you multiply it by 180 over pi. The pi's cancel out. Take 180 divided into 3 parts. That would be 60, and then 60 multiplied by 2 is 120 degrees. So radian measure, very straightforward. You really want to focus in on how do you convert from degrees to radians and radians to degrees, while also understanding what is our radian. It is the arc length of the, when there's an angle that's created, it is the arc length of that angle divided by the radius of the circle that if you were to create, that you could create.